Good morning, Suprabhatam to our America-based viewers. Good evening to our India-based viewers, and good day to people around the world. I believe this morning we have at least 300 plus people who are gathered in front of their computers, tablets, cell phones, uh, whatever convenient device to listen to Vishal Agarwal. Uh, my good friend Avatans ji is going to introduce him, but I want to kind of, in my introduction this morning, just say that I have known Vishal for a couple of decades now. We are kind of old warriors in this kind of dharma yuddha, if we may call that, in this battlefield of ideas. Um, and for those of us who have been here in the U.S., like I have been here now for what, 35 years, I have watched quite a bit of the kind of transactions about Hindus and Hinduism and India uh, in academia, higher education, and in the media. And now, of course, starting in the early 2000s on social media. Now, at present, wearing the hat of the editor of India Facts, I am pleased. I mean, it is my privilege this morning to begin this series of talks on Hinduphobia in academia. Uh, of course, even the term Hinduphobia is a kind of a contested term. We will not go into that, though Vishalji may point out and highlight some of those issues this morning. But India Facts, which I took over as editor just about 3-4 months ago, we decided that an otherwise vigorous, active site that India Facts was, publishing a whole variety of articles on matters Indic, would, from September onwards, September of 2020 onwards, focus solely on Hinduphobia. And we kind of decided on three aspects about what may constitute Hinduphobia. One is about uh, uh, identity, how our identity is being challenged in a variety of ways, either legal, policy issues ways, or in the kinds of publications on media, in academia, scholarly journals. It's also about our rights. What are the rights denied to Hindus that are offered to others? Here we briefly kind of mention about uh, Articles 25 through 30 in India. And again, that itself may be a topic for discussion in one of the later talks. And then the third aspect is about demography. Someone said, and I forget who, that demography is destiny. And especially in democracies, if you are 50% plus one, or if you are a sizable enough minority, you can influence policy, you can shape policy, you can deny things to others what you have, and so on. And so how Hindus and Hindu identity are threatened or challenged or denied in terms of these three aspects. So this morning's talk is the first in the series of talks that we focus on about the coverage, about the reporting, about the analysis, about the investigation into what Hinduism is, which itself is a contested term, and how Hindus are deliberately being targeted, including by these so-called academics who go on social media and carry on campaigns of vilification, mocking, and deriding, and all kinds of things. So, with that said, today's talk, where we are going to focus on how faculty, academics at the University of Chicago have dealt with Hindus and Hinduism, and promise you that there are going to be more talks, maybe more by Vishalji, but surely we will have other experts who are going to be telling us more about the nature of this very important campaign, because it's a programmatic campaign against us, against what we believe, against our lives, against our identity. So with that said, I would invite Avatans Kumarji to introduce to us Vishal Agarwal, as well as provide some do's and don'ts about today's engagement with viewers. Avatansji.
Thank you, Professor Ramesh Raoji. Namaste, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful webinar. And hopefully we will come out with a lot of information and some perspective on the academic Hinduphobia. My job today, right now, is to introduce Vishal Agarwalji, the main speaker of this webinar. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce him. I have known him for some time, and for a couple of years now, for sure. And before I actually knew him, I was told among our circle, if you need any resource information on anything on Hinduism, he is the one, he is the guy to go to. जो हिंदी में कहें तो resources की खान है विशाल अग्रवाल जी. So from all kinds of material. So that's how I started to know him, and then we have been interacting on various issues on that. And Vishal Agarwal ji, he has a long, illustrious introduction. I'll try to do my best and kind of making it short for everybody. But Vishal ji lives with his wife and his children in Minneapolis, Minnesota, 2 kids basically. And he has been there since 1998. He moved from India to the United States as a student in 1993, subsequently earning graduate degrees in engineering, University of Florida, Gainesville, and MBA from University of Minnesota at Minneapolis. He has been a professional with the medical device industry since 1998. And Vishalji is also a private scholar with several publications in topics related to India and Hinduism. And he has been a community volunteer and a leader in his region, and a practitioners of Vishist Advaita Vedanta tradition. He has a long list of community involvement that includes Hindu Society of Minnesota, Indica, and also Hindu American Foundation, Hindu Education Foundation, and Hinduphobia. And he has been speaking for a long time on these topics related to Hinduism, Hinduphobia, and other topics for a while. And he has spoken at World Association of Vedic Studies. He was a keynote speaker at Hindu Mandir Executive Network. He has also spoken at Human Empowerment Conference, Hindu Mahasabha of America, and Uberoi Foundation. He has been awarded several felicitations. He was given the Service Award by Hindu Society of Minnesota, Dharma Scholar Award at Hindu World Congress, San Jose, California, and Dharma Seva Award by Hindu American Foundation, Washington, D.C., and Prachya Vidya Prangata certification by World Association of Vedic Studies. And he has published several books and booklets and articles. I would not go through all of them. I would request Vishalji, if you can put up a slide towards the end about these, or I can put it up later today also to give people a kind of flavor of his writing and his accomplishments. So with that introduction, I would also like to quickly introduce my two of my friends here in Chicago, Rams and Nishant Bhai. They will be helping us in collating
Namaste.
some of the question, some of the questions that you have for Vishalji or any of the panelists here. Uh, for Q&A, we want you to specifically type your questions in Q&A section of this Zoom here. And we will pick up those questions as much as possible, depending on time, how much time we have. And other thing, a request to you is if you feel like, if you're on social media, please tweet or from here with the tagging India Facts. We have India Facts Twitter handle, and also share it on your Facebook, because we are streaming live on Facebook as well. And with that, I invite Vishalji to start his presentation.
Thank you for your kind remarks about me and for introducing the problem of academic Hinduphobia. Today, I will be focusing on the erotic school of Indology at the University of Chicago. In particular, I will focus on Wendy Doniger, the Marcha Iliade professor. She's the most influential academic in the field of South Asian studies and Indology in North America. As a case study, I will take her book, The Hindus and Alternative History, which is considered her magnum opus or the crowning glory of her 50 years of research. But first of all, we need to understand, what exactly is Hinduphobia. A phobia is an irrational fear, and the major cause of phobia is ignorance or a constant, sustained, stereotypical propaganda. Many people, unfortunately, even deny that Hindu phobia exists. But in the light of sheer data available to us, uh, no one can make such deniers see unless they take off their own blindfolds. Uh, the audience today will be surprised to know that the word Hindu phobia is more than a century old. It's actually first attested in an American publication in the late 19th century. Whereas, in contrast, the word Islamophobia, which is very widespread today, is a relatively new word with only a few decades of history. Recently, a scholar named Raj Vedam pointed to a study conducted by the Cornell University in which one of the tables listed the most important words that are used by artificial intelligence models to generate stories on different religions. So, as you can see, the most common words used for Hinduism and the problematic words are highlighted were caste, cows, Kashmir, Modi, Pakistani, which is like totally absurd. So, his comment was that learning biases in machine learning models is in news, and people have been complaining about gender and racial biases, prompting researchers to pay attention to training sets and to evolve appropriate anti bias metrics. GPT-3, with 175 billion training parameters and trained on many terabytes of web crawl data, is in use since mid-year last. And look at what they've come up with: caste, cows, BJP, Kashmir, Modi, Pakistani. So this study actually establishes the reality and magnitude of the problem of Hinduphobia that we are facing today. Unfortunately, hate mongering in the media often stems from hate mongering in the academia, in colleges and universities. And so today I will be focusing on this academic Hinduphobia. The next question is, has anyone ever even talked about it? Has it been exposed? And in the next 8 slides or 7 slides, I will show some illustrated examples of scholars who are trying to highlight this problem. First of all, we saw the word caste. Let's come to it. If you look at our core scriptures, the Vedas together have only 50 mantras out of 20,400 mantras that even mention this word or talk about it. We've probably read the Bhagavad Gita, which has 700 shlokas. Just about 20 of the shlokas refer to caste or talk about the duties of different castes. But if you read Indological Discourse on Hinduism, it is as if Hinduism is nothing but caste. The irony is that caste itself is not an Indian word. It's a Portuguese word, and it falsely collapses many different ways in which we divide our society, our families, our lineages. And numerous scholars have therefore come forward to question whether it's appropriate to apply colonial concepts like caste to describe the Hindu society. It stands to reason that the Brahmins are just about 4% of the Indian population. And if the Brahmins were so wily and cunning that they could dominate 96% of the Hindu population, then I would say something is wrong with the 96% of us. I am, as you can see from my name, I'm not born in a Brahmin family and nobody's oppressing or suppressing me. And yet, when you read these books, when you read media, it appears that there is darkness in the hearts of Brahmins, a phrase which actually Wendy Doniger uses in her book. My theory on that is, and people like Nicholas Dirks and Ronald Inden, they have suggested that just like racism is a modern European construct, essentially these scholars are imposing the concepts of race and using it as caste in the context of Hinduism studies. Some of us question, that whether Hinduphobia, objection to Hinduphobia is valid, and they counter by saying, well, these scholars have spent decades studying us. What about the scholarship that they have brought? What about the dictionaries and all the different tools that they have created? Aren't they trained to rigorous methodologies? Well, it turns out that the emperor doesn't really have any clothes. And in the past 1 decade, scholars like Vishwa Ardluri and Joydeep Bakchi have demonstrated how the German school of Indology and many other schools influenced by it have actually borrowed Protestant textual criticism methodology, and they have applied it very uncritically to the Hindu scriptural tradition. More often than not, the scholars of Indology and South Asian studies cherry pick data and pass off their own personal opinions as conclusive hypotheses. If you apply scientific methods to their works, their works just don't stand. Specifically, these two scholars have used the examples of Western studies on the Mahabharata and a very popularly known text, the Bhagavad Gita, and they have demonstrated how the Indian commentatorial tradition and editing is much superior compared to what the Western scholars are telling us. But more alarmingly, these two scholars have highlighted the Nazi affiliations of many of these German Indologists whose works are used by American and many other European Indologists even today. So it is not very surprising that the oldest Indology list, which is on the internet, started by Dominic Vojestic, expelled them on very flimsy pretexts because they were just too uncomfortable for these well entrenched ivory tower scholars. But having followed these Indology lists since 1998, it appears to me that in many of these lists, the rule is that Indians and dogs are not allowed. Only Indians who act as loyal dogs are allowed in these lists. So, a very pioneering school of dissent in this regard was founded by Professor Bal Gangadhar at the University of Ghent in Belgium, and it's been carried forward by his illustrious students like Dr. Jacob de Roover, and they have highlighted the Eurocentric and Orientalist foundations of India studies in general. They have also demonstrated how the adoption of their categories and how the use of a prism of Indian secularism has led to disasters in terms of academic rigor. They actually even question the category of religion to describe Hinduism. But unfortunately, we have a class of mentally colonized historians in India itself. We call them the Marxist historians, like Romila Thapar and RSS, I mean Ram Sharan Sharma, and their students like KM Srimali, D.N. Jha, Irfan Habib. And they, if you read the NCRT textbooks and their other works, they say that Hinduism is not a religion. Well, I would like to ask, would you apply the category of dharma to the Abrahamic religions? So, why do these people privilege inapplicable categories to describe who we are? An extremely influential and productive rebuttal technique to Hinduphobia is due to the efforts of Rajiv Malhotra and his Infinity Foundation, which has really shown the mirror to these Hindu-phobic academicians. Rajiv Malhotra came into limelight around the year 2000, and soon after that, he wrote an extremely influential essay called The Axis of Neocolonialism. He coined many terms like Wendy's child syndrome, and even in those days, and I'm talking about the early 2000s, his essays were read by tens of thousands of readers all over the world, and they changed many minds, in fact, including my own father, who would not, see the perspective from me. But when he read Rajiv Malhotra's essays, he converted, so to speak. So Rajiv Malhotra's essays and his subsequent, books, and there's another one which came out last a few months back, have really increased manifold the knowledge of Hinduphobia that persists and pervades the American and European academia. In fact, his sponsorship has spawned an entire series of decolonized or Swadeshi Indology studies. And recently, their focus has been on Sheldon Pollock, who got a big, editorship from none other than Narayan Murthy Foundation, which is a real shame. A very positive effort in this direction is also a beautiful new translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Jeffrey Armstrong, where he has decolonized the translations. He has used the terms which are prevalent in our own tradition. Just 2 days back, we saw this horrific scene of white supremacists storming the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. And what was the reaction of the Indians to it? I saw a tweet by a mentally colonized Indian woman, and she said that these supremacists were like the Aryans of ancient India. Why do I call her colonized? And the reason is that till the late 19th century, no Hindu anywhere in the entire Indian subcontinent had any awareness of this Aryan invasion theory or the fact or the claim that their ancestors had come from Central Asia and had dominated the Aborigines, so called Aboriginal people in India. But this highly flawed theory was proposed by colonial scholars to the effect that the languages spoken by 80% of Indians are derived from Sanskrit, and that's a foreign language. They also claimed that the Vedas themselves are of foreign origin. There was a colonial geopolitics involved in this theory, and it's still being used as a weapon against us. The theory has been used to project that Buddhism is superior to Hinduism, that South Indians are different from North Indians, and we still see that in the Dravidian parties in Tamil Nadu, that Hindus are more violent than the medieval fanatic invaders like Mahmud Ghaznavi and Babur. Unfortunately, the mainstream academia in the United States still clings to this racist Aryan invasion theory or its euphemistic versions like the Aryan migration theory. But an increasing number of scholars who are archaeologists, historians, geneticists, sociologists, linguists, they have written extensive scholarly criticisms of this colonial theory. What you see is just a sample of books. There's a whole library of books. Like if you see Professor B.B. Lal, who turned 100 years old this year, the Rig Vedic people on the bottom left is just one of the almost dozen books that he has written on this topic, and he's a doyen of Indian archaeology. The evidence of archaeology simply refuses to give any substance to this Aryan invasion theory. Another problematic stereotyping of the Hindus is projecting us as the real horrid erotic others. When you read the books of some of these scholars, it appears that we Hindus are, and I'm not mincing words, they literally tell us that we are rapists, we are sexual perverts, we are male chauvinist pigs and debauchers. A student of Wendy Doniger named Jeffrey Kripal, he suggested that Swami Ramakrishna Paramhans was a homosexual and a pedophile. Another protege of Wendy Doniger explained that the trunk of Bhagwan Ganesha was a limp phallus. And Wendy Doniger suggests in her book that Shankaracharya indulged in a sexual orgy with King Amruk and his wives. Disgusting stuff, but that's what these scholars think about our saints and our culture. I would think that these scholars, so called scholars, are perhaps venting their own fantasies rather than explaining our own tradition. Or perhaps their approach towards 1.1 billion Indians is like that of colonial anthropologists who would take these trips to a remote Pacific island like, say, Samoa, and then study the sexual habits of so called primitive Aboriginal people. Unfortunately, while other disciplines and of area studies have made real conscious efforts to decolonize themselves, Indology and South Asia study scholars and their mentally colonized Indian supporters have actually dug in their heels and they continue to even enhance these prejudices. If this Hindu phobia were restricted to college level, we would probably hear a sigh of relief. But it has pervaded the media, and unfortunately, they are even targeting our children. Their motto is to catch our children young and teach them to hate themselves. Within India itself, the NCRT textbooks that are used by the Central Board of Secondary Education and also in several Indian states indulge in rampant anti-Brahminism. If you read Ramila Thapar's sixth grade textbook used for 35 years in India, she has exactly one line, two lines for Mahabharat, a short paragraph for Ramayana. There is no mention of the Bhagavad Gita, no mention of Panini. All mentions of Sanskrits are negative. All mentions of Brahmins are negative. Whereas she has a glowing tribute to Islam in the last chapter in a book on ancient India. That's how insidious this propaganda is. The ICSE books are even worse. In Islamic countries in our neighborhood, Bangladesh and Pakistan, Hindus are routinely depicted as cunning, as cowardly, as scheming and plotting, who are always, planning something how to kill Muslims, which is not surprising. The goal of these history textbooks is to make non Hindu children get a very distorted and negative view of our culture and actually even indoctrinate our own children to hate their own heritage. And this has worked. In the last few decades of propaganda by NCRT textbooks, we see a lot of people in our younger generations who have turned against our own civilization and heritage. And this manifests in a lot of different ways in our mainstream culture. Today, if you look at a lot of Bollywood movies, even the food on their table is pasta and bagels. It's not even Indian food. The different actors and actresses of our movie industry in India, they act, they speak, their mannerisms are Western, they wear Western clothes. And recently, even the weddings are either all conducted in a church or in a gurdwara. The only time they conduct a Hindu wedding is when the bride wants to run away from the person she's being forced to marry, and there's a daring knight, Robin Hood, waiting to protect her. So that's how Hindus are stereotyped thanks to this indoctrination of the Hindus in school textbooks. So that brings us to Hinduphobia in the writings of Professor Wendy Doniger, who I said is the Marcha Eliade professor at the University of Chicago. She has guided over 5 dozen PhDs. Many of these scholars are now professors of Indian and Hinduism studies all over the world, and she's arguably the Maharani of American Indology. She herself has been a prolific writer, the ex president of the American Academy of Religion, which has over 10,000 professors as its members. And she is an extremely important voice in India phobic newspapers like the New York Times. Whenever there's an article on India, she is sometimes asked to comment as an expert. But where her expertise lies, let's just take a look. So why are we focusing in particular on this book, The Alternative History of Hindus? The major reason is that it is used very extensively in schools and colleges in the United States. I personally know students who have taken classes where chapters of her book were used as study materials, and they have been extremely disturbed and upset. They thought that their parents were lying to them about a glorious heritage and that we are a very depraved, a very debauched culture. There is an online catalog called the World Cat, which can help you find how many copies of different books are available in different libraries. Her book has an astonishing 1,100 copies in North American and European libraries. Believe me, there aren't many titles which have more than 100 or 200 copies. For 2 weeks, she was the largest, the number one selling title on Hinduism on Amazon.com. When she wrote the book in 2009, there was an immediate controversy. A lawsuit was filed against the publisher Penguin, and they were forced to withdraw the book. But pretty soon, another publisher called Speaking Tree published it in India. Whereas in the United States, she's been published. This book has been published by the Oxford University Press. In this book, she claims that she is giving a voice to she loves Hindus as she studied their traditions for 50 years. But I think that her love is like a bear hug, which is strangulating us. And she actually lands up insulting us. She claims that her book is about dogs, about women, and about Dalits. Just see the clubbing together of these three. But whenever she is talking about them, she actually insults them. For example, her book has two chapters on the Mahabharata where she discusses women characters, but all she talks about the women of Mahabharata is who slept with who. So, if you were to ask me how would you characterize her book, I don't think her book is even a product of scholarship. It's probably just a racy fiction book, and it tells more about herself than about Hindus. Uh, but before jumping into the book, let's look at something that we are more familiar with. Let's look at Mahatma Gandhi, since he's a global figure. What were the last words of Mahatma Gandhi? We all know it was Hey Ram. What was the title of his commentary in the Bhagavad Gita? We know it's Anasakti Yog. Mahatma Gandhi used the word Satyagraha as a tool to fight the British rulers. And how is the word Satyagraha dissolved? It's called Satya plus Agraha, which means that insistence on truth. And what is it that we Hindus are really, or Indians are really proud about our independence movement in India? We are proud about the fact that it was largely non-violent. Well, if you read her book, you get a lot of alternative facts. She says that the last words of Mahatma Gandhi were not Hey Ram, they were Ram Rahim, and the Hindu fanatics changed it to Hey Ram because they hated the Muslims. And actually, where did she get your information from? You Google it up and you will come across all these gossipy and conspiracy theory websites. So, but for that, for Wendy Doniger, that's real scholarship. She also says that the publishers got it all wrong. Mahatma Gandhi's Gita was a Sakti Yoga. And this claim is not surprising because often when she's describing yoga, you often feel that she's describing bhoga and not yoga. She claims that Satyagraha means Satya plus Graha, which I don't know, whatever, she wants to imply. And then she says our independence movement was not really non-violent, and she characterizes Hindus as a very violent people. And actually, she says she uses the words that the Indian freedom movement lasted decades and there was a lot of violence involved extending into these decades. So, these are her alternative facts that you find page after page. And indeed, the fun does not stop here. Even commonly known geographic facts are presented as alternative facts. She says that, like Japan, most of India is north of equator. Well, we know that all of India is north of equator. The southernmost point of India in the Nicobar Islands, which was called Point Pygmalion and now it's called Indira Point, is already 6 degrees north of equator. She says Mount Abu is in Gujarat. It's actually in Rajasthan. She shows Kashmir north of the Indus River in POK and China, and whereas we know that it's in the Jhelum Valley south of Indus. You can go on and on. She says that the Mandal Commissions reserved jobs for scheduled castes, and in protest, the Brahmins immolated themselves. I don't know where she got this from. The Mandal Commission reserved jobs for OBCs like Narendra Modi. He's an OBC. And it was not the Brahmins who immolated themselves. The very first person who immolated himself had the name Chauhan, which means that he was probably a Rajput. And then she repeats the lie that there was no Ram Mandir underneath the Babri Mosque, which the diggings have shown that it's totally false. She gets even elementary facts about modern day India incorrectly. In India, there is a series of military missiles, as we call in India, Agni, Prithvi, Vayu, Akash missiles. And she claims that given the violent nature of the Vedas, these missiles are named after Vedic Devi Devtas like Agni and Vayu, which is absolute rubbish because you can even read the government of India releases or even newspaper articles which say that the missiles are named after the five elements and they are specifically given names because of their characteristics. It has nothing to do with the Vedic Devi and Devtas. Uh, Her book has about 600 pages, and unfortunately, there is more than one error, just error of fact in the book. And you might say that, well, I mean, so what? These are just minor errors. Why quibble over these mistakes? But the fact is that these errors, they meet that proverb: garbage in, garbage out. And they lead to very comical conclusions that she reaches. For example, take a look at the Harappan culture, the Indus Valley civilization, or the Indus Saraswati civilization, as it's also called. It was the largest Bronze Age civilization in the ancient world. The area covered by it was more than 1 million square kilometers. It was larger than Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt put together. And what does she say? She says that the total population of this culture was 40,000, which is absurd. Actually, even a single city like Mohenjo-daro had more than 40,000 people. The estimate is 50,000 people. This culture has more than 2,000 known sites. So, if you average it, according to her logic, only five people lived per village or city in the Harappan culture. Similarly, her pattern of errors tend to give a pornographic twist to our scriptures. She quotes a text from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and she says that Prajapati raped his own daughter. Whereas when you read the passage, what it says is that Prajapati divided himself into a pair of a man and woman who then mated to produce humankind. So where does she get this rape from? It's totally in her own mind. Um, this slide is very busy, but you can make one slide per page and list these errors and the stupid conclusions that she has drawn. So what's really wrong with her book? We are all human. We make mistakes. Why even quibble over these minor typos? I wish that these were just typos. In page after page, Wendy Doniger uses her alternative facts to paint an extremely horrific and an extremely hateful picture of the Hindus. Sometimes she does not even spare the Sikhs and the Jains. Because of these alternative facts, Wendy Doniger alleges that our saints, our rishis, our mahatmas, they indulge in sexual orgies, and that when we worship different Devi Devtas, we Hindus are like cheating boyfriends. That positive things in our religion come only from Christianity and Islam, and all that we have done to Christians and Muslims is have a negative influence then. We are projected as an extremely violent, primitive, intolerant, anti woman, or whatnot. It appears that we are truly the white man's burden, and since she's a feminist, maybe we are the white woman's burden now. And so we need to be saved. So her book, which is said to be about women, Dalits, and dogs, actually lands up showing them in a very bad light. So let me give you an example that you can relate to very easily how she does about it. Recently, there was a big controversy. The Bollywood actor Saif Ali Khan made this statement about the movie Adi Purush that will be released sometime in the future. And in that movie, he's playing the role of Ravana. And he said that I'm going to humanize Ravan and I'm going to justify that why he abducted the Sita. So there was a lot of backlash, and he came forward to apologize for it. The first reaction when I saw this tweet from Saif Ali Khan was, well, did he read Wendy Doniger's books? Because if you read her books, this is exactly what she says. So let's see what she has said about Bhagwan Ram and Devi Sita and Lakshman and other revered Hindu, characters in the Ramayana. She says that Lord Rama was mentally weak. he was a male chauvinist pig, and he was a violence prone character who acted unfairly against Shurpanakha. According to her, he banished Sita from Ayodhya because he was scared of becoming a slave to the senses like his father Dashrath. She also says that Bhagwan Ram hated Bharat, and that is why he killed Vali, because he saw, that he thought that Bharat stole my kingdom, and likewise he said that Vali has stolen Sugriev's kingdom. She claims that Bhagwan Ram hated Lakshman because he had the hots for Sita. I mean, a totally pervert statement. And then she claims that Lord Rama deliberately left Sita to rot in Sri Lanka for years and years. She does not even spare Lakshman. She claims that Shurpanakha that he was mean to Shurpanakha because he refused her booty call. When Shurpanakha tried to entice Lakshman, he rejected her, and so he was being mean to her. Well, apparently, any girl who comes to man, and if she proposes, whether the man is married or not, he should respond positively. Otherwise, he's being mean to her. That's Doniger's logic. But if you read the Ramayana, the truth is totally different. Valmiki Ramayans, and I've cited the verses here, they clearly say that when Rama and Lakshman both refused to marry Shurpanakha, she actually blamed Devi Sita for coming in the way. She called Devi Sita a slut. And then she rushed towards Sita and she yelled that I'm going to kill you and I'm going to eat you. Immediately, Bhagwan Ram came in front of Sita to shield her, and he asked Lakshmana to take out his sword and chop off Shurpanakha's nose. Now, is this being mean to Shurpanakha? Are they male chauvinists? I don't think so. So, as for Ravan being, a good human being, keep in mind that Ravan might have been a scholar, but he was a serial rapist. He had raped at least three women, which whose names are mentioned in the scriptures. Vedavati, there was a Gandharv lady, and there's another lady. And he had misbehaved with his own sister-in-law, the wife of his half-brother Kuber. The last woman he raped cursed him that he will die if he repeated this with any other woman, and that's why he dared not touch Sita. And oh, by the way, Bhagwan Ram did not leave Sita ji in the forest in Sri Lanka for years. They had already spent 13 years in Nasik and other places, and she was there for about 11 months. Another revelation or alternative fact that Wendy Doniger states is that Dashrath died 6 years after Rama was banished. But if you read the Ramayana, she says it's 5 years, but if you read the Ramayana, it was on the sixth day. So, let me not even respond to other gossip that she has about Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Suffice it to say that, her alternative facts about our scriptures remind one of Kellyanne Conway, quite a clownish character in our recent political history in the United States. Another issue with Wendy Doniger's facts is that they are based on very outdated information, and this leads to very erroneous conclusions. For example, she claims that Sanskrit is an artificial language and it was first used in inscriptions by not an Indian ruler but an Indo Greek ruler named Rudraman because he wanted to fit in the Indian society and he wanted to get the approval from the evil Brahmins. The alternative fact and its interpretation is cut and pasted from a recent book by Romila Thapar, of course. But if only Doniger and Thapar had read the archaeological reports going back to early 80s, 35 years old, they would find is there are at least two inscriptions which are they are 250 years older than Rudraman's inscriptions, and both these inscriptions were patronized by Brahmins, which means that the Thapar Doniger theory about foreigners bribing Brahmins to become Hindus is totally false. Take the example of the word Mrigahasti, which is used in the Vedas to describe an elephant. This has been used by colonial historians and their followers like Romila Thapar to argue that Aryans were invaders in India. Why? Because in Central Asia there were no elephants. So when they came to India, they saw this curious elephant, a really strange animal with a trunk, like it has a hand. And so they called the elephant as an animal with a hand. But there is a little problem. The Vedas are written in a very poetical language, and they even call the snake a rope with teeth. Now, which is the only country in the world which doesn't have any snakes? Well, there were surely snakes in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and Iran. And if you were to follow the Thapar Doniger colonial logic, you can only conclude that the Aryans must have only originated from Ireland. It's the only major country in the world which does not have any indigenous snakes. So, if you read Doniger's books, it appears that nothing has been published on Harappan culture since 1930s, and 90% of our references are given by her are from ancient reports from 1920s and 30s, or they are from secondary literature. Obviously, if you look up a British colonial map on India, you will never find Chandigarh on it, because Chandigarh was founded in the latter half of the 20th century. And so, that's the problem that her book suffers from, using outdated data. She calls herself as a recovering Orientalist, and actually, she proves to be quite a regressive Orientalist. She exhibits a real tone deafness when it comes to portraying history, and she refers to the Hindu main street, the Hindu society of Sultanate India, as, I mean, hold your breath. She characterizes our society as monkeys and people's colors, smells, and chaos, which is just a variant of the cow, caste, and curry stereotype. So she also says that compared to us ugly Hindus, she doesn't use the word ugly, but she calls us monkeys and peoples and colors and smells. She says that the mosques, in contrast, I mean, they provided a valuable contrast and they were very serene. Now, doesn't this remind you of the divide and rule policy of the British colonialists? In her book, quite in the beginning, on the 40th page, she said that the motto of Hindus is follow the monkey. Statements like these remind me of racists in the United States who compared President Obama to a monkey very often. In fact, even after President Obama lost the he ceased to be the president in 2016. There was a email from a government official who referred to Michelle Obama as an ape on heels. It's a total reflection of the racism in these minds. And just like colonial historians said that everything positive in India came from the West or from a region closer to Europe, Doniger also says that all our great culture, our art and literature exists because of the influence of Indo Greeks, the Shakas or the Scythians, the Kushanas, and other foreigners who ruled parts of India. So, this is actually a theory which is promoted by our Marxist historians. And so there is almost kind of a bonhomie between the Hindu phobic historian, Indologists in the West, and the Marxist historians in India. This is a really alarming thing that you see in her book. On the left, I am showing images of two hymns from that were used in Christian churches in the 1800s. They would refer to all non-Christians as heathens whose hearts are filled with darkness, and they said that they all these dark heathens need the light of Jesus Christ. And so they sent these teams of missionaries and conquerors. We know what this light of Jesus meant to the native cultures of Americas and the Africa. There were massacres, there were extinctions of native cultures, there was imperialism, colonialism, slavery, and looting. But Doniger appears to live under the delusion that now she has the duty of bearing the white woman's burden and liberate Hindu women. Her book almost reads like Catherine's Mayo Mother India, which Mahatma Gandhi called the Gutter Inspector's Report. And page after page, she claims how Hindu women are oppressed by Brahminical patriarchy. In her moral compass, the only women in the Hindu society who are liberated are the ones who sleep around. That's her moral compass. And just because our tradition favors monogamy and it says that you marry within into families which favor tradition, she says that the hearts of Brahmins were filled with darkness. This is the exact word she uses, the Brahmin heart of darkness. and it's exact cut and paste from the 19th century Christian missionary hymns that were used to demean and debase the other cultures. In fact, her romantic fantasies about the status of women in Islamic cultures will put an ISIS bride or a jihad Jane to shame. She claims that it was because of the Hindus that the Muslims borrowed customs like the wheel and caste. I would like to ask her that where did the Arab countries get their burqas and hijabs from? And didn't the Turkish and Afghan invaders have their own versions of caste system? In fact, when these foreign Muslims like the Mughals, the Turks, and the Afghans came and converted Indians to Islam, they would not consider Indian Muslims as their own equals. They considered them as unequals. If you read the Muslim chroniclers who came from Arabia and other countries and see how they describe Indian Muslims, they use words like kamina, which means, and now you know where this word has come from, which means that these people are wretched and they are inferior. Throughout the Islamic world in history, the white slaves commanded a much higher price than a brown or a black slave. Now, surely this religious discrimination and racism was not because of the evil Hindu influence, or are we supposed to believe that the heart from the heart or the darkness from the hearts of Brahmins somehow also went into Arabia and other parts of the Middle East? So here you can see her book is not just replete with errors, it is full of very hateful propaganda. The top four pictures show how we perceive our saints as symbols of spiritual teaching, of joy that comes along with spiritual enlightenment, whereas the bottom picture shows you how she sees our saints. According to her, all our saints are just lecherous, they're debauches, and all our core Hindu teachings in spirituality, like Prapatti and Advaita, are because of influences from Islam and Christianity. Whereas the fact is that these doctrines are older than these entire religions. You had versions of Prapatti and Advait before Christianity or Islam were even born. In keeping with her racist attitudes, she sees only slums in India, not just in modern India, but even in ancient Kashi or Varanasi. And then she uses that perverted perceptions to create very ridiculous theories. She said that already in ancient Kashi, the cities in ancient India, cities like Kashi were overcrowded and they had slums. And that is why the Hindus came up with the theory of rebirth and reincarnation. But I would like to ask, what kind of a logic is this? If your country is overcrowded, you would want that a person who dies should not even come back. Once they are gone and dead, they should just stay away. Whereas the theory of reincarnation and rebirth actually says that a person who dies comes back. So it looks like she often types her books faster than the mind can think. Or think about how she transforms very spiritual episodes in the Upanishads and gives them a very pornographic twist. In the Upanishads, it is often taught that a true disciple must approach his guru with humility and sincerity, not with ego. In the Chandogya Upanishad, there is a story of a very good king. His name was Janashurti Pautrayan. He was a very good king, but he was proud of his accomplishments. And he hears that there is a cart driver named Rekva Muni who can give him spiritual wisdom. So he approaches Rekya Muni and he offers him wealth. And Rekya Muni turns him away. He said, I'm not going to part with my spiritual wisdom for your money. And then the king comes back with even more money, and Rekyamuni again refuses to give. Finally, the king comes along with his prince and he says, would you be kind enough to marry my daughter? And what is Wendy Doniger's interpretation of that? She says that finally Rekyamuni relented and offered his spiritual wisdom. Why? Because he was offered the princess for his bed, which is very pervert. Any Hindu parent who is watching my seminar will know that when we look for a suitable groom for our daughters, we always marry our daughters above us. We always want her in laws and her husband to be higher than us. So when Janashruti Pautrayan, the king, When he wanted to buy that wisdom because he was proud, he was refused. And only when he acknowledged the superiority of Rekya Muni and he humbled himself was when he became a suitable person to become a shishya of that, But anyway, after Rekya Muni gives the teaching, Doniger doesn't get she doesn't even understand the teaching. And she says that Rekya Muni's teaching was quite commonplace. So quite clearly, she totally missed the mark. So keeping with that theme, she characterizes Hindus as the horrid erotic other. She says that when Hindus worship different devis and devtas like Agni, Vayu, Vishnu, Shiva, we are being like serial monogamists. A person who says, Helen, you are the only love I have. And the next day, when he sees Susan, he says, Susan, you are the only girl I have ever loved. That's how she characterizes Hindu bhakti. But what she does not realize is that Susan doesn't know that he also loves Helen. Whereas we see Vishnu, Shiva, Indra, Vayu, and all the other Devi Devtas as just different forms of each other. And when we worship our different Devi Devtas, it's like saying, you know, um, Kanchan, I love you as the mother of my children. I love you as my wife. I love you as the daughter of your parents. I love you as the daughter of your as a daughter-in-law of my parents. Or he says that I love my wife, I love my children, I love my sisters, I love my parents. That's the example. These are the examples that our Hindu tradition and our acharyas actually give us to explain how the worship of different Devi Devtas actually merges into the worship of a single divinity. She does not even stop there. She imagines, orgies in the lives of our saints, and she says that Shankaracharya indulged in an orgy with King Amruk and his queens. And then she gives the reference of a commentary by Ravi Chandra on the Amaru Shatakam. There is only one copy of this old publication in the whole of United States, and I was able to get a copy of it. And the copy is actually right at the University of Chicago. And it is very interesting what the commentary says. It says that when King Amaruk died, Shankaracharya used the yogic technique of Parakaya Pravesh because he wanted to get some experience of Grihastha ashram. And the queens realized very soon that this is not our husband, that this is some saint who's living in the midst of us. So the queens told the ministers that we don't want this saint to leave the palace and take away the blessings. So we wanted to go around and find if there is a rishi or a saint whose body is in the forest and we wanted to destroy it so that the saint never leaves us. And how does Wendy Doniger describes it? She says, well, probably the queens found him better in the bed than their own dead husband. That's her pervert pornographic interpretation. She even manages to twist a mantra of the Rig Veda, which is actually a charm against malevolent forces that might cause a woman to miscarry when when the woman is pregnant. And she uses the words bhratravya, which essentially means a community of those yatudhan or the malevolent forces. And she says the pregnant woman might find her own brother in her bed. That's the kind of perversity that she you see in her books page after page. uh, Doniger also makes it appear that the large scale displacement and destruction of temples and their replacement by mosques was some kind of an architectural blessing on India. Why? She says it motivated Hindus to construct even larger temples. Well, I guess if somebody, comes and destroys her house, that should be considered a blessing because then she'll be motivated to, build a bigger house. I don't know what kind of views she has on the ongoing destruction of temples in Pakistan, Bangladesh, or even in the Kashmir part of India. Just as neo Nazis deny the Jewish Holocaust, she seeks to deny or apologize for the large scale destruction of Hindu shrines. She also tries to justify the large scale persecution of Hindus under the Muslim rule. There are at least 8 times in her book where she makes this atrocious claim that the destruction of Hindu temples by fanatical Muslim rulers was foreshadowed by so-called destruction of viharas and Jain temples by Hindu rulers. And she also says that the Hindu iconoclasts were like really environmental conversionists. They believed in conserving the environment because they only recycled the parts of Hindu temples and constructed mosques out of them. This is like, Nazi propaganda of, Goebbels. And the sad part is that she repeats this lie 8 times in her book in totally irrelevant chapters. Like there were no Hindu temples in the Indus Valley civilization or Harappan culture, and you will find this example repeated even in that chapter in totally irrelevant contexts. Whereas credible historians have emphasized that destruction of temples by Muslim rulers was very widespread, whereas the destruction by Hindu rulers was very incidental and a very rare occurrence. And it stands to reason that if Hindus were the primary destroyers of their own temples, then what about the vanished churches and fire temples and Buddhist viharas and other religious shrines all over the region in Iran, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Turkey? Where did they all go? Did the Hindu rulers go and destroy them also? So, this characterization or apologia for Islamic iconoclasm is actually a part of her pattern in which she depicts Hindus as being bad people and Muslims as being totally good people. According to her, if you read her book, Hindus are always at fault and Muslims are always and they are completely good. In fact, the only influence that we had on the Muslims was bad. In our tradition, there is a celebrated example of Harihar and Bukka who were captured by the invading Tughlaqs. They were imprisoned, they were taken to Delhi, and they were forcibly converted to Islam. Somehow, Harihar and Bukka gained the trust of the Tughlaq king, and they escaped. They went back to South India, and under the influence of Swami Vidyaranya, they converted back to Hinduism and they founded the Vijayanagar Empire. And how does Wendy Doniger describe this? She says that Harihar and Bukka double crossed the Sultan. There is another celebrated episode in my own tradition, the Sri Vaishnava tradition, in which Ramanujacharya went to northern India to retrieve a murti which had been looted by a sultan. The sultan had used that murti as a doll which he gave to his princess. So Ramanujacharya daringly went and he stole that murti back and came back and installed it in the temple. And how does Wendy Doniger characterize this episode? Her exact words are that Ramanujacharya took actions against Muslims. She also says that bhakti promotes interfaith violence. And she says that all temples were symbols of oppressions, just like we hear some of the woke crowd in India at JNU say. But when she starts describing the gardens and the fountains built by the Mughal elites for the Mughal elites, she says that they were very valuable gifts to India. Those of you who are from Karnataka would know, sage Sant Basavanna and the Lingayat Veerashaiva traditions. She says that Basavanna in Karnataka rejected the social hierarchy, and this could only be because of Islamic egalitarianism. But when the Veerashaivites indulged in violence, she alleges that it was because of the influence of Tamil Hindu Shaivites, who, according to her, were very violent. And this one takes the cake. She says that it was a Vedic reverence for violence which flowered in the slaughter that followed partition. I don't know what she means. Maybe she imagines that even the Muslim and the Sikh rioters in 1947 held sword in one hand, the Vedas in the other hand, and they were chanting the Gayatri mantra instead of Allahu Akbar, Nara Takbir, and Jobole Sonihal. That's the kind of not so subtle hate mongering that you see in page after page in her book. So, we have spoken to some of the problematic aspects in her book, The Alternative History, but there is a pattern of this pornographic depiction of Hindus and hate mongering in her many other writings, actually, right from the very first book that she wrote in early 1970s. I would like to ask Avatans and Ramesh, our moderators, if they would like to take a break at this point.
Thank you, Vishal. I believe those who are listening to you talk uh, wish that you continue to talk. But I believe now that you have spoken for about an hour that you need a break. And maybe I will I will pitch in with a couple of comments about the infamous Wendy Doniger, who unfortunately has almost acquired this goddess status for our so-called secular, progressive, liberal Indians, Hindus. It's unfortunate that so many of our own, in our own families, our friends, have gifted her books to their own families and friends without even bothering to read a page of that book. Or if they did, were such uncritical readers, were such uninformed readers that they deserve that kind of, how do I say, mentoring by the really depraved. And I use this word knowing full well the nature of the word. And I use that also because I know something about Wendy Doniger from one of her own PhD candidates who earned a PhD under her guidance, who, when, back in the 1990s, mid 1990s, when, we began to talk about these matters, Rajiv Malhotra had begun writing for Sulekha. A couple of us were also writing. And my friend told me, Wendy is known to be provocative. And you use the word provocative. And give me examples of how she would come dressed in see-through blouses deliberately to make her male colleagues uncomfortable. And that during a panel discussion, when it was, and they had, microphones in front of each one of them, she provocatively whispered into her own microphone, "These ziplets fucks with me." And here I know there are all kinds of people today listening to us, but hey, we live in 2021, and I hope you don't mind my using the F word here, but that is the nature of Wendy Doniger, bringing her own sexual persona, sexual frustrations. And of course, she is also clear that she uses Freudian psychology. And Freud was, as someone said, all about sex and food. And while Freudianism has been debunked, Doniger and her students continue to embrace it, celebrate it, and unfortunately, so many Indian readers, that so many thousands of copies of her books have been sold in India, you know, should make us aware of the nature of education that we have got, you know, uh, in India, and how higher education in India itself has been uh, basically hijacked by Hindu folks. Um, and therefore, your masterful kind of summary, and I know you have a lot more information to share with us, but we are about an hour and 10 minutes into our 2 hour session here today. I want to check with Avatans Ji if he has got a comment to make, or if at this point, maybe one or two, questions which kind of maybe you could briefly address. Um, so let me pass uh, the microphone on to Avatans Ji and see if he has got any questions or comments.
Yes, thank you, Vishalji. It was a very enlightening presentation. Um, I had I have done some of research of my own, and one of the interesting things that about Wendy Doniger comes up is she is, in her own words, when she was felicitated somewhere, and it's a video of that is available on the internet, and her how she got into Harvard and all that. And I just want to read a short line with them. And she says, "When I went on to graduate school at Harvard, my life as a Sanskritist floated on in its tiny, unstructured paradise. No PhD qualification exams, no need to fill out long application forms for grants. The relatively few people who applied to go to India were more or less automatically financed. And that's how we have a scholar. Okay. It's not anything else. It's like, by chance. There was no no competition or anything like that. And there's a lot of you mentioned South Asia Library in Chicago. It was founded by one of the former spies of CIA, spy scholar. I
Wow.
have written about it, so you can look it up somewhere. Uh, but
She
the
got
question
the
I wanted to ask is that, there's a lot of criticism that goes on. There's some of the critiques of Hinduism, for example, could be genuine and academic. Has there been a format so that we can separate the genuine criticism or critique from Hinduphobia?
so I think your question is, can we sift genuine criticism of Hinduism in her books from Hinduphobia? And I
Is
would
there a
say that
format
her
for
books,
that?
her books are certainly not in that category. There is nothing to sift. There is no genuine criticism of Hinduism in her books. Um, but there are some books which try to critique more substantial Hindu doctrines, in our darshanas. Uh, and for example would be, there's a book called A Modern Critique of Vedant, and it takes issues with some of the principles of Vedant, looking at it from the perspective of modern Western philosophy or other philosophies. There was a scholar named Daya Krishna who wrote very learned critiques on the darshanas of Hindus, from a very learned perspective. There is a scholar named Bimal Matilal who wrote very he died prematurely, unfortunately, but he wrote very learned books which covered a much broader range, including the Hindu epics. So there are those works available, but as people say, I mean, how many people go to a gourmet restaurant? Most of the people would go line up outside McDonald's and Burger King's to buy French fries, and that's the case with Doniger's books also. In fact, one of her critics describes her books exactly like fast food, junk food, which sells a lot, but which is really injurious to health and has no nutritional value. So yes, there are learned critiques, but her books are not in that category.
Thank you. With Rameshji's,
Yeah.
if I have his permission, I can ask Nishanji or Ramji to come up and pose some of the questions that are in the chat Q&A chat box.
Yeah, quickly, Vishal, if you want to, because I know you have a lot more information to share today, but we don't also want to overwhelm our viewers, our listeners, and 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 I think there may be enough questions from people so that maybe if we, I think it may take you about 15, 20 minutes to
Definitely.
respond to them. So go ahead to the questions. And if we, and again, I would, recall you, get you back here on the India Facts platform to give us more talks. And we are going to be, in fact, having that series of talks. So at this point, if Nishant ji and Ramsundar ji have those questions, I would suggest that they ask those questions, and if you could spare some time, Vishal, to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll take the first question. I kind of answered it partly, but Vishalji, you can explain more. So there are like two questions, similar questions. One is it says a caste is a Portuguese word. How could it have been referenced 50 times in Vedas? And the similar question along the same lines is, can you provide any sentence in Vedas where the word caste is used? So that was one of the first questions.
Yeah. Well, the word caste is not used in any Hindu scripture because it is not any Indian language word. But you will have similar words, like varna, or similar words in the Vedic literature. What I meant to say was not that the word caste is used in the Vedas 50 times. What I meant was that there are just about 50 verses which even refer to, Brahman, Rajanya, or Vish, or Shudra. There really aren't many references to any, of these the fourfold social stratification in the Vedas. In the only one verse, the Rig Veda has 10,552 mantras. There is only one mantra where all the four varnas are mentioned, and there are a few mantras where the Visha or Vaishyas are mentioned. There are probably a few more in the Atharva Ved Samhita, Priyam Ma Krunu, Deveshu Priyam Rajasu Ma Krunu, and it mentions the other two varnas also. But if out of more than 20,400 mantras, if only 50 even refer to the names of the four varnas, what does it show? I mean, in the eyes of Vedic rishis, this was not really a central concept that it's being made out to be. In the Bhagavad Gita also, if you read translations of some of these Indologists like George Thompson and Lars Martin Fosse, they routinely translate the word karma as caste duty. That's totally wrong. The central concept in the Bhagavad Gita is swadharma, and your varna is only one of the determinants. The other determinants are desh, kal, paristhiti. So, whichever varna you belong to, your circumstances might warrant you to act in a specific way as long as your intention is very selfless and your intentions are good and they're guided by spiritual values. So, when these Indologists routinely translate a simple word as, like karma as caste duty, they have totally missed the message of even this more popular scripture.
Okay, thank you. That was actually a question from Pushpita Prasad and Ned Mohan. So there's one more which I don't know if you want to take, but it says, has someone given a response to Ambedkar's book, Who Are the Shudras and Untouchables, where he has quoted interpolations and wrong translations? So any thoughts on that?
So I remember that in late 90s and in early 1990s, there was a big controversy on a book called Riddles on Hinduism by Dr. Ambedkar. It was an excerpt from his overall complete writings of, you know, Baba Ambedkar. Here's what I would say. First of all, Dr. Ambedkar, he had done a thorough study of our scriptures. Um, Having said that, there were responses given at that time. I might have in my collection an extremely old booklet that was published in Maharashtra, and it was called Riddles of Ambedkar. And then after that, Arun Shori published a book called False Gods. And that book drew a lot of criticism because there is an Ambedkarite lobby in India. And I'm not sure if that book was banned, but I certainly have a copy of it. And likewise, recently I came across some Arya Samaj literature which questioned his interpretations of the Vedas. Um, my point is that Ambedkar ji he did experience a lot of discrimination because of his Harijan background in his life. And because of that, he had a certain response to it. Um, and all of his responses might not have been to my liking, but let's respect him for what he experienced, and the movement did lead to emancipation of Hindus of the so-called lower castes, but the exaggeration that we see in the writings of Indologists are quite a fiction of imagination. And there's a particular slant that's given to every passage that you read. um, for example, in the Chandogya passage that I was referring to, and this will give an example of how much they tamper our scriptures. So Wendy Doniger says that this Rekya Muni, who gave his spiritual wisdom to Janashruti Pautrayan, was not a Brahmin. So I tried to find out where did she get this gem of nugget from, and she refers to the translation by Patrick Olivelle. Now, what has Patrick Olivelle done? He has changed the traditional text of the Chandogya Upanishad. Raikyam, the king, asks his courtiers to go and look for a learned Brahmin named Raikyamuni. And Patrick Olivelle changes it from Brahman to a Brahman. So that is the extent to which this kind of tampering is happening in our own lifetimes, where they want to give a casteist twist. So Doniger gives it her own twist. She says, well, this wisdom could have come only from a humble non-Brahmin who was nevertheless, motivated to give it only because the king agreed to send his daughter to him. So it's, on one hand, it's trying to elevate the Dalits in her opinion, but then she's only trying to portray them also as somebody who are motivated only by sex. And so you can see the tampering that's in this 1 hour presentation. I cannot give too many examples of how Indologists have tampered our texts. They have changed the wording, and and that leads to a lot of wrong and negative conclusions. Maybe we can complete the slides now because it'll just take
Sure.
20-15 minutes, and it
Yeah,
might even
we
be.
have some other questions lined up, interesting ones. So we'll get to them, but you can go ahead and finish the slides, Vishalji.
Okay. All right. So that brings me to examples from some other books that she has written, her other writings. Uh, Another book that was in great controversy about 10 to 15 years back was a book on Bhagwan Ganesh by Paul Courtwright. He is a professor at the Emory University in Atlanta. And he's also a protege of Wendy Doniger. So he asked her to write the foreword to the book. And in the foreword, Wendy Doniger says, if you can see the picture, we all know that Ved Vyas dictated the Mahabharata to Bhagwan Ganesh. And so Bhagwan Ganesh was a scribe. But in the alternate reality that Wendy Doniger lives in and the alternate facts that she keeps churning out, she says the Mahabharata tale was dictated by Ganesha to Vyasa. And you cannot even call this a typo, because then she uses this alternative fact to say that every book exists in the mind of the all knowing elephant headed god, and we are merely scribes like Vyasa. Somebody obviously pointed out this error to Paul Courtwright or to the publisher, and so when they reprinted the book after 1985, they changed this word, only changed one word. And now the sentence reads: the Mahabharata tale in which which Vyasa dictates to Ganesha. But just by this mechanical change, now the following paragraph doesn't make any sense. If Vyasa was not the scribe, then how come the book exists in the mind of Ganesha? So these are the kind of manipulations that you see in forwards in books that they write, and then it just doesn't make any sense. After her book on alternative history was published, Wendy Doniger went gung ho, and a publisher in India called Aleph, which also publishes a lot of other Marxist historians, published a collection of her essays, which is called On Hinduism. All along, I've been talking about this caste curry cow syndrome, and I've given examples of how Wendy Doniger has used caste and cows. So probably you might be wondering, where is the curry gone? And here it is. She talks about Hinduism as extremely violent. We have already seen that she terms bhakti as a dangerous doctrine which promotes interfaith violence. Now, here she's saying that Vedas are also violent, Even Vedanta is very violent. Why? Because it motivates Hindus to kill women and Muslims. And then she concludes on the next page that classical Hindu India was violent in its politics, religious practices, criminal law, climate. And her conclusion is violence is as Hindu as curry. The problem is some people do like the curry. They do like the flavors, and nothing good can come out of the Hindus. So she has a footnote saying, oh, by the way, a lot of the spices used in the curry are imports from other parts of the world. So there we go. We are just bad. Anything that's positive in the Hindu society must come from outside. We are just, violent people with a low character. This is a very funny example of how Indologists find very cheap thrills in their own writings. In the United States, when you go to a grocery store and you wait to pay for your purchases, there are stands containing conspiracy magazines and gossip newspapers, which have screeching and sensational headlines. Some of those headlines that I remember reading was Jennifer Aniston seen without her wedding ring, and then there's even an issue which said Michelle Obama breaks down while confessing to her adultery in front of the cameras. Now these gossip tabloids do have a market, which is why they sell, and they also prove their sensational stories, the QAnon type of conspiracies, by incorporating some doctored photographs. And so, what do these Indologists do? They prove their theories by incorporating doctored translations and, like I mentioned, even altered Sanskrit texts. So we come to a book, which I mentioned, the on Ganesha by her protege Paul Courtwright. In that book, and you see the last row, he made a very sleazy claim that Daksha had raped his own daughter Sati, who was the wife of Shiva, while she was visiting him. And this book gave a reference to Wendy Doniger's other book called Hindu Myths, which is the second last row. So I decided to check that book. Well, Wendy Doniger says that at night, the man was so delighted by the perfume that he made love in the manner of a mere beast. There is no mention of a daughter, so that's totally Paul Courtwright's insertion, a cheap thrill. So Paul Courtwright also gave the same reference to Devi Bhagavad Puran that Wendy Doniger had, and I got a copy of that exact edition that Wendy Doniger had used. And there's a translation given by pundits like Pandit Ramtej Pandya, and I have also given a translation. All it says is, and it explains why Sati in the Devi Bhagavad Puran, gets upset because she was actually the Devi who was born as a daughter in the house of Daksha. And the person Daksha had intercourse was not, he did not rape his daughter. It just describes the fact that Daksha met his wife in the Nijgraha, in her own their own bedroom, and that's the lady he had in the bed with her. So here you can see it was almost like, some kind of pornographic literature that Donigers and Courtwrights are generating. They are giving it even more pornographic, a more perverse twist, and it just gets more and more magnified. Uh, so, like I said in the beginning, these Indologists don't even spare our children. They don't spare anyone. They don't care, whether who's reading their works. So the Microsoft Encarta had articles on different religions, and the article on Hinduism was written by Wendy Doniger. When that article was released, there was a lot of protests from Hindus, as a result of which Microsoft took off that article and instead asked Professor Arvind Sharma to write a more accurate and a more sympathetic article. And the reason was very obvious, because all that Wendy Doniger's article described was animal sacrifices, blood, sexual acts. If you read her description of Holi, she says that the color represents blood, which was used in the place of Holi in ancient times. I'm not even sure where she gets this from. Whereas if you check the articles on Islam and Christianity, they were written from a very respectful stance. So finally, when Microsoft Encarta listened to Hindus and replaced her with Professor Sharma, she got very upset, and she gave an interview and she said that people who criticize are only all dangerous, violent Hindu nationalists who have no tolerance for a non Brahmin, non Hindu woman writing on their religion. But just as we heard a few weeks back, she is a sore loser. Uh, it is not that her work has not drawn criticism. Many, even though she remains the Maharani of South Asian studies in the United States, many other, although lesser influential scholars who are not always friends of the Hindus have been very scathing in their criticism. In the middle top, there is actually a report from the BBC, and the BBC says that Wendy Doniger is extremely crude, rude, and lewd. I have highlighted a statement by a German professor. He says that her books are like fast food, which is really junk food. They attract a lot of attention and readership, just like junk food sells a lot. But I might add that if you eat a lot of junk food, you can only get bad health. Another American professor, whom we hope to cover in a future episode, named Michael Witzel, says that her translations are totally unreliable. And a Greek professor, Nicholas Kazanas, who is actually a disciple of the Sringeri Shankaracharya, he criticizes her for even sexualizing the spiritual metaphors. And he is totally on the mark because if you read her first book, Shiva the Erotic Ascetic, she always quietly inserts the word erect everywhere in before penis, and wherever the word urdhvaretas is used, she says it shows that Shiva was sexually ambiguous, whatever that means. Whereas in the Hindu tradition, the word urdhvaretas is used for a chaste, a celibate person. But for her, it could only mean sexual ambiguity, like, a transvestite or something like that. So, it is not just Hindus who have been the victims of a rude, crude, and lewd behavior. During a previous national election here, federal election here in the United States, she said that Sarah Palin, who was then the governor of Alaska, is the greatest hypocrisy. Her greatest hypocrisy is that she is a woman. And when she was questioned on that, she replied, I am not an expert on Sarah Palin's hormones, and I don't doubt that she has a womb, but she's certainly not acting like a womb. I mean, her actions, her writings, and her words are like the atrocious things that people like Kim Kardashian do every other day to get grab attention. I mean, that's how pompous and arrogant she is. When we come to Indian Marxist historians' relationship with Wendy Doniger, it's more of a love and hate relationship. These Marxist historians are themselves incapable of reading the classical languages of India, and they're very poorly read in ancient Hindu or Jain or Buddhist scriptures. So, what they have done is they've outsourced this part of the scholarship to Western Indologists, and they just borrow and swallow their biased interpretations. But when it comes to history writing, these Marxist historians are very zealous protectors of their turf. They will not accept that Hinduism even existed before the British came. So how can they accept that Wendy Doniger's studies on Hindus in ancient India are valid? Because Hindus didn't even exist at that time. But ever since Doniger has been in controversy for her Hinduphobia, there has actually been an increased bhaichara, bonhomi, chor chor moseri bhai, between these Marxist historians and Western Indologists like Wendy Doniger, because now they have found the common enemy. The common enemy that they have is the self-respecting Hindu who has started questioning their biases and prejudices. And just like in politics, it's true also in academics that there are no permanent enemies and there are no permanent friends. There are only permanent interests. Given the stereotyping and ethnocentric descriptions, the clearly racist, demeaning descriptions of Hindus that you find in Doniger's works, it is not very surprising that she is a darling of the violent and dangerous white supremacists, the kind that stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C. just 2 days back. Her books often actually serve as a dog whistle to them. Someone posted on a discussion board, which is associated with David Duke, a white supremacist, asking what he could do to spread hatred against Asians in America. And another white supremacist wrote a response. He says, why don't you use Wendy Doniger's books? And he says that she is a white nationalist soldier, and her work highlights the negative influences of Hindus in the world. I have posted a link. If you try accessing this link from your work computer, you will get a balloon, red balloon, saying that that site has violence. So try accessing this link from your personal computer. So when Doniger is questioned on her shoddy biases, how does she respond? She makes even more atrocious statements. Like the Bhagavad Gita is not a nice book. Krishna was only preaching violence in the Gita. She starts attacking Hindus, but at the same time, she also plays victim, and she says that all of her critics are Hindutva types. They are MCPs, they are castistes, and they are Victorian prudes. Whereas the Sanskrit texts are very sexy, like she said in one of her writings, that in Indology you don't have to choose between sex and in scholarship. And she says that Hindu males who object to her writings will not tolerate discussing this topic with a woman. Well, I can tell you that, they say there are 63 genders today, and not even one person from any of those genders would be interested in discussing this topic with an 80-year-old woman. Her other response is that she cannot be a white supremacist because she's actually Jewish. Well, I mean, duh, so what? Donald Trump hates immigrants, but all the three wives he married are immigrants. Hitler was a vegetarian, but he killed millions of Jews. And the Nazi army itself, there's a book called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, and it reveals that 100,000 soldiers in the Nazi army had one fourth to one half of Jewish blood in them. Life is full of contradictions. Her family members might have undergone the Holocaust, but there is no reason why she should promote another Holocaust of the Hindus. Uh, there is no evidence that Doniger ever underwent professional training in psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, which is actually a very discredited field now. And yet, she liberally uses words like penis, castration, beheading, and she mixes them with pornographic interpretations to describe themes in our culture. Once, at a annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion, Rajiv Malhotra confronted her publicly, and he said that you keep psychoanalyzing 1 billion Hindus. Why don't we psychoanalyze you? And she gave a very disdainful, condescending smile and she said, well, my life is an open book. But this is kind of a cop out because when a book is open, it forces us to focus only on the page that is open and not the other pages which are not open. An open book can actually conceal more than it reveals. And being the prolific writer that Wendy Doniger is, she has actually written a lot about herself. There is a whole book that she has written about her family. But let me quote from a briefer autobiography. She narrates an incident from her childhood where her dad taught the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, to her brother, but did not teach it to her. And when she asked, her father said, no, I cannot teach it to you because you're a girl. So maybe that's what she is reading in the Hindu tradition. On page 54, she also describes how her husband, O'Flaherty, was the last name, which is why some of her books are, Doniger is her maiden name. Then she got married to Dr. O'Flaherty and then she divorced. And she describes how her husband dumped her, even though she had earlier made sacrifices for him. So, if you read this biographical account, you can start connecting the dots. In her biographical account, uh, she says that Hindu scriptures are stories of devoted but abandoned women. And when she's writing that, she's probably thinking of what happened to her when her own husband dumped her. And maybe her resentment towards her own brother is what's reflected in her interpretation that a pregnant woman might find the brother in her bed. And when she is expressing her resentment against Indians, and when she's writing about the darkness in the hearts of Brahmins, maybe this is because of a resentment towards her non-white women colleagues who advanced in their careers at Berkeley while she was unemployed. She says that such women who were married to white professors were referred to as pillow dictionaries. That's coming straight from the horse's mouth. And I would dare say that in her worldview, probably even the Vice President elect Kamala Harris is just a pillow dictionary. Now, nothing what I said here has any scientific basis. I'm not proud of what I'm saying here, but the probability of how you can use these facts to connect the dots about her interpretations probably has more probability of being truthful than about her own textbooks, which brings us to some of the last slides. What has really changed? We keep talking about imperialist, colonial, racist scholarship on India, but what about Donigers? Have they really changed anything? In the 19th century, they said the white man's burden. Today, it's become the white woman's burden. In 1800s, they used to describe Hindus as killers of children, as dark savages, people who burned their widows, who oppressed the low castes, who were worshippers of juggernauts and other monstrosities. And today, Wendy Doniger and her other colleagues describe us as Muslim killers. There is a book on psychoanalysis which claims that Hindu mothers do not love their children. We are just their objects of study. There are websites and books which say that Hindu scholarship should be questioned. Michael Witzel wrote to me in an email saying that Hindu males are not critical scholars, but Hindu women are better than Hindu men. Imagine what that means. And they keep ranting about dowry murders, oppression of Dalits, sati. So nothing has really changed. In fact, today our Devi Devtas are said to be ones who conduct rape, who seduce, who are addicted to drinks and sex. The Aryan invasion theory has become the Aryan migration theory. There was darkness in the heart of Hindus and other heathens in the 19th century. Today, there is still darkness in the hearts of Brahmins. So nothing has really changed. In fact, in this age of internet and global communication, the writings of these Indologists have actually even exaggerated Hindu phobia, and it's not just Hindu phobia. I think we should use a stronger term, Hindumesia. It promotes active hatred against Hindus. So, in conclusion, is her book really an alternative history? Why do people spend their entire lives to study a culture and people that they really hate? And I would like to ask, don't Christian missionaries serve cultures all their lives only to destroy and convert heathens to Christianity so that all these native cultures just become museum pieces? Doesn't a bear give a hug which strangulates you? Isn't the love of a pedophile very perverse? And so is the fact with a lot of the so-called scholarship and decades of labor. In one of her books, Wendy Doniger says that she has been writing for the American audience in her mind. And so she's taken aback when Hindus read her books and become angry. I mean, what is that supposed to mean? Is it proper for non-Americans to draw conclusions about non-Americans to conclude about United States just from Hollywood movies or Playboy? I mean, that's how her books are like. If you read her books, you will get a totally stereotypical and a very prejudiced impression of who we are as a culture and a civilization. But what really disturbs me is that, even more than the publication of her substandard work by renowned publishing houses like Oxford University Press and Penguin, and their use by professors indicates that the academic peer review process itself is broken. It doesn't even exist. And worse, Hinduphobia is probably normalized in American academia. Right in the beginning, I showed you some of the buzzwords that are suggested for writing articles in Hinduism. It's cow, caste, curry, Pakistan, Modi, BJP. And so hatred for Hindus is very normalized in American academia. But just because their books sell a lot doesn't mean that they are good. They are just like junk food and fast fries. How do we counter this problem? And so that is what there's one thing that I tell all parents when their children are going to college. I tell them, please tell your child not to register for any class on Hinduism or India. We don't need to patronize these professors, because these taking these classes only have a negative impact on our own children. But more important than that, nobody's going to come and save us. It is only we as Hindus who can save our heritage. And so it is very important for us to awaken, to arise, and to study our heritage, to practice it, to have faith in it, to believe in it, and also fight distortions of, the distortions that are thrown at us in the name of scholarship. So that's all I had for today. And now we can probably take on questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Nishantji, Ramsundarji.
Excellent,
Yeah,
excellent, Vishalji, excellent. I have a few questions that I can we can take. Let me see, which one was that? Uh, okay, so this one comes from Shrikant Ramdas. On the back of Wendy's book, I found one well-known Indian Mahabharata translator giving giving the book a rave review. I was taken aback. Care to comment on him? I know who that person is, but my guess is I know. Do you have any comments on that? Do you want to comment on that,
Well,
Vishal?
he's probably referring to Vivek Devroy. I don't hesitate to take names. It couldn't
Okay.
have been Devdutt Patnaik, who's her admirer. And it's really unfortunate. People, literally these kind of rave reviews are like toilet ek prem katha. Because, when you go to a toilet and pick up a magazine, you just don't read it for any spiritual or any intellectual enlightenment or education. You just read it casually. And so probably all these rave review writers just took her book as kind of literature that you would place on a cistern of a toilet, and read it casually and laugh and pass your time till you're ready to go and wash your hands. And that's how I would treat these positive reviews.
Um, there was another question from Nalini Mehra. I think we've already answered it, but what could be Doniger's motive for distortion of our ancient scriptures and texts? I think you already answered it, but if you want to give a quick 1 minute, half a minute answer.
While there can be a charitable explanation for it, and there can be a less charitable explanation for it. A charitable explanation for it is that that's her nature. Her worldview is of a society where there is, free sex, drugs, and booze, and then she imposes that worldview on Hindus. A less charitable explanation would be that, maybe she genuinely hates us. Otherwise, how can you have atrocious statements like darkness in the hearts of Brahmins, or that the Vedas and the Vedant and Bhakti teach us to kill Muslims? That's a pure, indication of the hatred that she has in her, and some of it probably could be due to her own experiences in her life. Maybe after she was dumped by her husband, she made advances to many people. We've already heard something about her from Professor Ramesh Rao, but maybe all her advances were rebuffed, and that is why she calls Lakshman and Ram as mean, because they were married and yet they refused to go along with Shurpnakha, abandoning their own wives. So there are a lot of explanations there that you can give to explain Wendy Doniger's, but studying her is not important. Studying, responding to her and studying our own heritage is more important. It is only a house fly which ignores the entire beautiful body and sits only on a festering sore. So let's not study Wendy Doniger. Let's focus on our own tradition and write about it in more accurate and empathetic terms. Thank you.
Vishal,
Uh,
that's a nice segue into another question that I found very interesting here. So from Manish, I think Pajan, it's down, I think it's somewhere in the middle. What are the organized methods to put forward authentic views on Hinduism in American academia and mainstream society? And what has been your experience? That's my own question I'm adding to it. What has been your own experience? I know you have met Wendy, so if you could share your thoughts.
So if you cannot change the system from within, you have to create a parallel and an alternate system, and eventually the old systems wither away. That could be one approach. A second approach could be, as I say, if you don't have a seat on the table, you'll find yourself in the menu. I would say that we Hindus really have to get used to and become familiar with the academic way of studying our tradition, and responding to it. Um, we are born and raised in a culture. Our interpretations of what our tradition teaches us is very different from people like Wendy Doniger, who gets a Fulbright scholarship and spends a grand total of 1 year in Kolkata, and then she comes back, and then she goes to India only as a tourist. Um, so I would recommend, rather than giving a long answer, there's a book called Academic Hindu Phobia, which is a collection of essays by Mr. Rajiv Malhotra. And let me show the cover of that book. And in that book, here's the book on the bottom left corner. I would really recommend that you buy this book because right in the beginning, there is an interview. And the last question, actually, and as a disclaimer, I am the interviewer. So I'm interrogating Mr. Malhotra, and I asked him the same question, and he gives a very good answer with 6 or 7 points on what we should be doing. So I would really recommend that you get this book. If you don't have it, please write to me, and I will send you that excerpt digitally. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just checking out. I mean, there was a similar question, I think, from Jay Gina as well. So my thought is, this is a series anyway, right? So we won't be able to take up all the questions today, but I think we can certainly collect some of these questions, prepare answers, and then maybe get back to them at a later date, or take it up even in some of the future sessions. A few of them have certainly asked, what do we need to do? Or what's our response? That's basically the nature of the questions that I see here.
So what we need to do is, study our own heritage. Don't allow our children to register for any of these classes in any of the U.S. colleges. In this digital age, we have this fantastic medium to bypass uh, academic cartels. So please publish your stuff on blogs. If these professors show up at conferences, definitely go and confront them, but not angrily, but in a very polite and professional manner. So there are many, many different ways. Don't rely on their translations. Don't buy their books. There are much better translations available by Gita Press and many other publishers in India. Um, and our children learn not from what we preach to them. Our own behavior is the biggest teacher to our children. And when they see us practicing our traditions and show pride in our traditions, they will understand. For example, when my children make a negative comment which is inaccurate about my tradition, I tell them that I'm proud of my heritage and I give them the correct perspective, why their perception is wrong and what's the right perspective. So we really need to engage our children. We really need to engage our social circles. Let's not try to be cool and worry about antagonizing our friends. If you go to we Indians are big into socializing and parties, and if you see someone making silly comments because he's an expert on Wendy Doniger's book, well, you need to counter him with the right facts in a very polite way and show that it's not very cool to promote prejudice against your own heritage.
Okay.
Incidentally, internet and computers are something that people like Wendy Doniger and Romila Thapar really criticize. In 1990, when the computers were first becoming popular, Romila Thapar wrote that she hates the NRIs for countering her because they use something called a computer. That's how she used. And so and then when the internet became popular, she wrote a foreword to a book on the Donier Polo religion of Arunachal Pradesh. And there she said that the internet is going to promote fascism and intolerance because now people have the right to say whatever they want. So keep in mind that for all their claims that they stand for academic freedom, these people actually don't stand for academic freedom. They want to control our minds, they want to control what we say. And even Wendy Doniger in her books has complained about the freedom that the internet offers. They are not for free speech or freedom because they know that their falsities and their fraudulent statements will be questioned in democratic media.
Okay, I believe
Thank
we
you.
are approaching the end of our 2 hours. Many, many, many thanks to Vishal. You bring the kind of scholarship, the interest, the commitment, and I think what you said about the onus being on us, because what I have seen in the past 35 years living here is that unfortunately many of us take the easy route out, um, subscribe to WhatsApp University instead of sitting down and reading books, or reading the kinds of articles and monographs and books that you have written, or the likes of people who have done their work, who have shown the shraddha necessary to counter these, because indeed, and we have to acknowledge this, we have to see this facts clearly. Hindu phobia is a growing phenomenon, and it has now seeped so much even into the media. And as a scholar who has been doing some content analysis of the New York Times, I see how sustained and programmatic this demonization of us is. So once again, thank you for this. And we are going to invite you back. We are going to have a series of talks on this, the kind of work done at Harvard or, Emory and other universities, uh, and to show, it is both a kind of a Western enterprise, but then also how that Western enterprise has now become part of the quote unquote Indian liberal progressive enterprise. And unless we approach this carefully and in a disciplined way, then we will lose this battle. So once again, thank you so much for your time, for all the work that you do, and we will invite you back again. And I want to thank my co-hosts today, Avatanji, Nishanji, Ramsundarji, and Abhinanji back in Bengaluru. I thank all of my technical support people in Hyderabad. With that, have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you for the
Namaste,
opportunity.
everyone. Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you, Vishalji.
Thank you, people. Thank you, Vishal. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Can we, I think, I would love to see these questions saved so that, we can prepare a response at some point in time.
Yeah, I think they will be, they can extract the questions out. So
Yeah,
should
just
be
like
okay.
what we did during the Indic
Yeah.
feminism webinar, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Professor, I'll probably be in touch with you as well. Maybe we can take it up, prepare a response.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Okay.
Okay. I got to now attend another call.
All right. Bye.
Some of my Seva International people for a report that we are releasing. So thank you once again so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.